But first of all, we're going to start with the spark. What does that look like in our stories? I love this quote from Chris Fabry that says, "A novel is a flame that sparks inside each of us. It's this novel that keeps burning until we transform it into paper." How do we put this story onto paper? Where do we get this flame that we can turn into a novel? Now, some of these are just some different ideas that I use in order to get some of my story ideas that I've written. Now I've published about 30 novels now, and I think I've gotten all of my ideas from one of these 12 different places as I've worked. This is sort of our matchbook. This is sort of like when we go to light our fire. This is our matchbook, our ideas that we have waiting for us. First of all, friends and family. I believe we're all curators kind of the stories that God has given to us, the stories and experiences in our lives. Now, many of my book ideas have been sparked from a story also, not from just my life, but from a story that someone has shared with me. Now, I don't take anything that somebody tells me in confidence and write a book about it. That's not right. I don't do that, but there are so many people out there that would love to have their story told. So I had let's see, about 10 years ago now, I wrote a novel called Chateau of Secrets. And that novel was completely stemmed by a story that somebody came to me, told me that her mother-in-law had hid Allied airmen and members of the French resistance actually in her chateau, in her castle in France during World War II. And it was just this incredible story. They had tunnels underneath the chateau. And while she's hiding people under the chateau, the Allied forces actually, not the Allied forces, the Nazis were actually occupying the top two floors of her house. So she was doing this literally underneath where the Nazi officers were living. So it was a heroic story, and the family was absolutely thrilled to have me write that book. And so just being aware of those stories that are around us. Unsolved mysteries, unresolved mysteries. This is actually my favorite way to get novel ideas. I am a journalist by profession. That's what I did for a long time before I started writing fiction. And so I have a lot of stories I would learn that would never actually get resolved. And that sort of drives me crazy. I want to know the ending of it, of the stories. And so as a novelist, I can take some really difficult things that happen and be able to create something good, something positive, give it a happily ever after ending, take a sad ending and make something good about it. All right, old diaries and books. For those of us who are historical novelists, this is a gold mine. I am able to go to my interlibrary loan or to my research librarian who orders me books through interlibrary loan. I love to visit state archives. I get original journals there. I get letters. I get all sorts of things that haven't necessarily been read by a lot of people. Now online, we can go to Google Books and Project Gutenberg and find thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of books now, I think have been put into Project Gutenberg. And just with a couple clicks, you can pull up old journals and old books right there. Burning questions like, what do you have in your head that you're trying to resolve? Maybe a story, but also just maybe some spiritual questions, things that you don't have answers for. I wrote a novel, an entire novel once on the just trying to figure out why bad things happen to good people. That was just a question that was burning in my head at the time. And I was having trouble trying to figure out just answers to this really difficult question. And so I wrote a whole novel on it. Each of my main characters had sort of a different response, a different answer to this really difficult question. And so I was able to sort it out in my head through my characters. And then it was a good journey for me. That novel has now been published, it's out there. And I'm hopeful that as readers read it, they'll also be able to wrestle through that question as they read the story. Book or movie characters, if you're watching a movie and you're like, oh, I really like that secondary character, it's always kind of fun just to pull that character out, change the name, maybe change their gender, change some background information on them, and then give them a story of their own. I've seen that done multiple times, and it's really fun. Travel and setting is another great place. When we travel, we go to some place with new eyes, a new perspective. We can pull things out, look for the stories. Agatha Christie, when she wrote Journey or Murder on the Orient Express, she was actually on the train. That's how she got her idea. She was taking the Orient Express, and so she was inspired by the travel, by the train, but then there's also this unresolved mystery that was happening in the news at the time with Charles Lindbergh. His child had been kidnapped. And there was this, and people didn't know what happened at the time to this little boy. And so she took this unresolved mystery, paired it with her travel on the Orient Express, and wrote one of her best-selling novels. Interviews is another great way. Sometimes I'll be talking to somebody and I'll say, "Hey, that is a fantastic story. Do you mind if I record this?" And people are so gracious, almost always. I think always people say absolutely. But just be a collector of stories. I met actually about a month ago in my little town. Somebody said, "There is a lady that lives just a few miles from you that lived in Germany during World War II as a child, and she remembers it." And I read a lot of World War II era fiction. And so I just said, would she be willing to talk to me? And she was. Spent a couple of hours with her, incredible story. And I don't know, I don't know if and when that's going to actually turn into a novel, but things that she said, not just sharing her story, but she also told me that you can't, what did she say? She said, "Don't judge a person until you hear their story." And I just thought that was fantastic. And that is absolutely going to make it into one of my books someday, just that theme. But it's just being able to collect people's stories, hear their stories, and write it down. Surfing the internet, which can obviously be a huge distraction, at least for me, kind of getting sidetracked from my real work. But it's also a fantastic resource. I just have to keep myself from going down that rabbit hole. I give myself perimeters, perhaps a deadline of how long I am sort of surfing. But it's been phenomenal for me. A few years ago, I was working on a novel, A Friend. It was a story that somebody had told me about these caves, these hills in Maastricht, Netherlands, in the southern part of the Netherlands. And she said, "There's all these caves. I know something must have happened there during World War II." Started to research it. Sure enough, something had been happening there during World War II, but it wasn't enough for me to write a whole story about it. And so I jumped online, started doing some research, and I was able to uncover this story of this gentleman named Johann von Holst, who had rescued 600 children in Amsterdam during World War II. Amazing story. He had just started talking about it recently, and he was still alive at the time. He was 170 years old, 107. And it was incredible, but I wouldn't have been able to find his story if I hadn't gotten online and just started surfing. So we can find some really great stories online if we just give ourselves some parameters. All right, childhood experiences. I wanted to show you this because on that writer's retreat that I went on in Oregon, this is a little town near where I stayed called Yamhill, about 1,000 people there. And this was actually where Beverly Cleary grew up. This is her farmhouse. And she attributes this lovely farmhouse and her kind of simple childhood there to having these experiences that she was able to write about later in her many books that she wrote. And I just thought this was a fantastic because we all have such unique childhood experiences, and they may seem dull to us or like nobody's going to want to hear it, but we all have experiences that nobody else has experienced. And she sure did. Wrote about these stories in 100 million books plus later. Just from her childhood experiences, she has written those many books. All right, I have epitaphs in abandoned houses. Now, nobody else there, maybe a few of you are inspired by going to cemeteries, but I love to go to cemeteries and wonder at people's stories. My husband actually just last year bought me a little plate for my license plate that says, "I break for cemeteries," because I'm always wanting to stop and read people's epitaphs because it always gives me ideas for stories. Same with ghost towns, abandoned houses, that sort of thing. Lots of people have been inspired to write novels and books from dreams. I always recommend that people keep their note app open or a notebook beside their bed. Something that you inspired to write during the night is probably not going to be easily remembered in the morning. You may wake up and think, "That's a terrible idea," but it may be a really good one, and entire novels have been written from dreams. So I recommend just being prepared for that. And then last of all, as a follower of Christ, I just believe that prayer and reflection is a really important part of our writing process, whatever we're writing. I remember probably, I don't know, this is 2016 actually. sat down. My agent at the time, I had an idea to pitch, and she was like, I need to have two ideas to pitch. And I didn't at the time have a great idea for her to go out and pitch for a new novel. And I remember sitting at a coffee shop in my little town, an old house, and I'm sitting there and I'm just praying, like, Lord, I want to write a story. I feel like I'm called to write a story, but I don't know what I am supposed to write. And so just praying through this, and I remember, and it wasn't a vision, it was just like this picture in my head. There's this old tree outside the window, and I just had this picture of a tree house, and there's a little boy and a little girl in it. And I really instantly knew it was Germany in 1938. So I had this picture, and the little boy and the little girl were gonna have to run away. And that was all. That's all I had, was just this picture. And I had a title, Catching the Wind, had a title of this for this story. And then I actually, I had to sit down and I had to still write it. I still had to do the work. But through a whole lot of prayer, through that entire book, God gave me that story. And I really feel like that's an important part of my own journey in writing.